The wind cut through the plaza like a blade, slicing past tourists and citizens alike. The sky hung low, an overcast shroud casting a pale hue over the National Veterans Museum. Near the grand steps, an old man shuffled forward, his shoulders stooped, his cane tapping unevenly on the stone. In his arms, he cradled a crumpled American flag, its faded stars barely visible beneath his trembling grip. He paused at the entrance. His eyes, cloudy with age, still held a flicker of purpose. Every step had been a burden, every bus transfer a test. But here he stood, ready, steady, and silent. He took one more step before the young security guard blocked him. "Whoa, hang on there," the guard said, not unkindly but certainly without warmth. "You got ID?" Joe O'Connor opened his mouth, then closed it. He reached into his coat pocket, producing a worn leather wallet. Inside was a military photo, old and sun-faded. The guard barely looked. "This doesn't count." "Sorry, sir. This museum's for real veterans." Joe blinked. The people in line behind him shifted uncomfortably. A teenager snickered. A woman turned away, muttering. No one stepped forward. Joe nodded once. No protest, no plea. He turned slowly, the flag pressed tighter against his chest, and stepped back into the cold. His breath fogged the air as he lowered himself onto a nearby bench, alone. The museum's glass doors reflected the marble memorials behind him, those inscribed with names he knew by heart. Inside, warm exhibits honored sacrifice. Outside, the man who had lived it sat unseen, bearing history in silence. Joe O'Connor sat motionless, the crumpled flag still clutched to his chest. Around him, the city moved on. Cars passed. Children laughed in the distance. A street vendor hawked roasted peanuts nearby, the scent of warm salt and char rising in the winter air. But Joe didn't move. He stared ahead at the reflection of the museum's glass facade, his thoughts thousands of miles and decades away. The sounds of helicopters roared again in his memory. Not traffic, Hueys. Not children, shouting Marines. Not peanuts, but the stench of jungle sweat and diesel fuel. It was 68, the jungle thick with rain and rot, the Khe Sanh Valley erupting in green tracer fire and chaos. He'd been a corporal then, leading a squad through the mud when the ambush hit. It came fast, mortars first, then the crack of rifles. Men screamed. A young lieutenant, fresh out of Quantico, panicked, froze. Joe had pulled him out, half dragging him through enemy fire as shrapnel cut into his side. He didn't think, just moved. The same instinct that got him into Beirut 15 years later. Different terrain, same chaos. He remembered the bombing, the barracks collapse, the smoke and fire, the bodies of Marines buried under rubble. He'd dug for hours with his bare hands, refusing to leave until every last man was pulled free or confirmed dead. He didn't talk about it afterward. None of them did. Joe blinked, returning to the present. His breath now came shallowly, tired. His body ached from sitting so long on the bench, but he refused to move. He wasn't sure why, but something inside him had shifted. That rejection at the door, just a moment, a shrug from a young man doing his job, but it had hit harder than any bullet ever did. For decades, Joe had stayed quiet. After his discharge, he raised a family, worked as a mechanic, never asked for much. His daughter, Megan, a schoolteacher, always told him he should speak more about his service. But Joe didn't see the point. What could he say that the world hadn't already forgotten? Today was supposed to be different. December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. A day he honored not because he fought in that war, but because he knew the cost of it. Every year, he'd come to the museum, usually alone, to pay tribute. This year, Megan had begged him to let her drive him. He declined. He didn't want her to see how slow he'd become. How frail. Now, part of him wished she were here. Inside the museum, young veterans wandered between exhibits, taking selfies beside old warplanes and statues. Uniforms crisp, boots polished, stories still fresh in their minds. Joe didn't begrudge them. He admired them. But there was an unspoken divide between their generation and his, a sense that time had erased his battles, made them irrelevant. He shifted slightly, and something slipped from his coat pocket, a faded photograph. He stared down at it. 4 men, grinning in the dirt of some long-lost outpost. One of them, younger Joe, sat shirtless, dog tags glinting under the sun. Next to him, Mick Ramirez, the best shot in their unit. And behind them, arms crossed and smirking, a kid named Derek Blackwell. Joe let out a long breath. Blackwell. The name struck something. He remembered how raw the kid had been, how green. And how brave, running into fire to save a wounded radio operator. Joe had pulled him from a burning jeep during the Tet Offensive. They'd lost touch after the war. He squinted. Couldn't be the same guy, he thought. The general, what was his name now? Derek Blackwell? Before the thought could settle, a voice pierced the fog of memory. Excuse me, sir. Joe looked up. A man in civilian clothes, perhaps late 30s, stood before him. He wore a small pin on his lapel, an eagle, globe, and anchor. Mind if I sit? The man asked. Joe gestured silently to the empty space beside him. The man sat, exhaling. I saw what happened. Back there. At the door. Joe gave a faint smile, no bitterness in it. Not the first time. Well, it shouldn't have happened, the man said, glancing toward the entrance. My name's Carter. I served in Iraq. Second tour. Joe. Vietnam. Beirut. Carter turned fully to face him now. That explains the look in your eyes. I've seen it before, in mirrors. They sat in silence for a while. The wind had softened slightly, and the last of the morning clouds were giving way to sunlight. Carter fished something from his coat pocket and handed it to Joe. It was a thermos. Hot coffee, he said. Take it. Joe hesitated, then accepted it. His fingers wrapped around the metal like it was sacred. You ever wonder if anyone remembers? Carter asked, staring straight ahead. Joe chuckled softly. They remember the stories. Not the men. A long pause followed. Then, Carter stood. I'm making a call, he said. This isn't right. You belong in there. Joe raised an eyebrow. To who? The president? No, Carter replied. To someone who can do something. He pulled out his phone and walked a few steps away. Joe didn't expect anything to come from it. He'd lived long enough to know how bureaucracy worked. But as he took a sip of the coffee, its warmth spreading through his chest, he felt something. Not hope exactly. But maybe a flicker of dignity. He looked back at the museum. The crowd had thinned, but the doors remained open. The same security guard stood inside, staring at a tablet screen, his expression unchanged. Joe didn't hate him. The guard was just a kid, maybe 25, following protocol. Still, the ache in Joe's chest wasn't from age. It was the ache of being erased. Of outliving your own relevance. Of standing at the gates of memory and being told you no longer mattered. Joe leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the wind. Somewhere, far off, the sound of rotors echoed again. Colonel Rebecca Hayes strode through the corridors of Fort Franklin's command wing, her boots clicking sharply on polished tile. She had just wrapped an intelligence briefing when the alert pinged her encrypted phone. Incident at National Veterans Museum. Elderly Marine turned away. Name, Joseph O'Connor. Claimed service in Vietnam and Beirut. No ID. turned back by security. Attached was a blurry phone image, an old man in a battered coat, hunched on a bench, clutching a folded flag to his chest. Rebecca froze mid-stride. She knew the name. Joseph O'Connor, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. Silver Star at Khe Sanh. Survivor of the Beirut barracks bombing. A legend spoken of in hushed tones in briefing rooms and command tents. He was part of the lore passed down to young officers. But he had faded from records, from visibility. No one knew where he had gone. She opened a secure line to General Derek Blackwell's office. Colonel Hayes, the aide answered, startled. "I need to speak with General Blackwell now. It's urgent." Joseph O'Connor was turned away from the Veterans Museum. Seconds later, the line clicked and Blackwell came on. "Say that again," he said, his voice tight. "O'Connor. He's alive. He was denied entry earlier today." Silence stretched on the line. "Where is he now?" "Still outside the museum. A witness took a photo. No ID. Security dismissed him." "I'm going to him," Blackwell said. The line went dead. Rebecca grabbed her cover and headed out the door. She knew where he'd be going. The convoy of black SUVs swept through downtown like a storm front. Civilian traffic was cleared by local police. As they arrived outside the National Veterans Museum, a hush rippled through the block. Pedestrians paused. Phones lifted. Something significant was happening. Joe O'Connor hadn't moved from his bench. Inside the museum, the security guard remained at his post, unaware of what approached. General Blackwell exited the lead vehicle, flanked by aides. He didn't pause to acknowledge the murmuring crowd. His face was granite. Colonel Hayes trailed a few steps behind, already anticipating what was about to unfold. They entered the museum with purpose. Staff members backed out of their way instinctively. Who was the guard on duty when the veteran was turned away? Blackwell demanded. The young man stepped forward, stiffening at attention. "Sir, yes, there was an older man who attempted to enter. He lacked ID." "That older man," Blackwell said, "is Joseph O'Connor. He carried me out of a burning vehicle in Vietnam, with a bullet in his gut and shrapnel in his thigh. He saved my life while he was bleeding to death." The room froze. "I owe him every day I've lived since," Blackwell said, voice low but cutting. "And you turned him away." The guard stammered. "Sir, I didn't recognize him," he didn't say. He didn't have to. The silence was suffocating. Museum visitors and staff stood suspended, listening. Blackwell continued. "This museum honors service. And yet, one of the greatest living Marines was left outside in the cold because he didn't look the part." Rebecca stepped in. "General, permission to deploy an honor detail. Fort Franklin is 10 minutes out." Blackwell nodded. "Make it happen." She moved to make the call. Minutes later, a second convoy arrived, this time a transport of dress-uniformed Marines from Fort Franklin. They formed a double column along the museum's approach, boots sharp against the pavement. Civilians watched in silence. Something was shifting. A young Marine approached Joe. "Sir, General Blackwell requests your presence inside." Joe looked up slowly. The cold had settled into his bones, but his eyes still held clarity. He rose with effort, waving off the offered arm. "Still walkin'," he muttered. The Marine stepped aside as Joe began the slow march toward the building. He passed through the corridor of saluting Marines, each snapping to attention as he moved. His cane tapped against stone. Onlookers stepped back, not from fear, but reverence. Blackwell waited at the top of the stairs, cover tucked under his arm. His expression was unreadable. Joe halted before him. Recognition passed between them, silent, deep, unshaken by time. Blackwell saluted. Sergeant O'Connor. Welcome home. Joe's salute was slower, shakier, but resolute. I remember you, he said, his voice thin. You pulled me out of the fire, Blackwell replied. I never thanked you properly. Didn't do it for thanks. I know. Blackwell stepped aside and extended an arm. Would you do me the honor of entering with me? Joe hesitated, then nodded. Together, they walked forward. The crowd erupted, not with cheers, but with sustained, respectful applause. Some people wept. Others simply placed hands over their hearts. As they entered, the security guard lowered his eyes. Blackwell paused. This man needs no ID. He carries it in every scar, every memory, every loss. Joe entered not as a visitor, but as a sentinel of all the museum stood for. Under the great archway of the Hall of Honor, he stopped and looked around at the faces, the awe, the respect. He finally felt seen. The Hall of Honor stretched wide and solemn, lit by soft spotlights that cast a golden sheen over engraved names lining the marble walls. Joe paused just past the entrance, eyes adjusting, heart pounding. For decades, he'd avoided places like this, shrines to memories too heavy to revisit. But now, shoulder to shoulder with General Blackwell, he stepped in as if walking into the belly of history itself. Colonel Hayes flanked them, her expression unreadable. Staff and visitors had cleared a respectful path, leaving silence in their wake. Blackwell motioned gently toward a polished bench beside the Medal of Honor exhibit. Sit, he said. You've done enough standing. Joe gave a dry chuckle, lowering himself slowly. Don't have the knees for anything else. Blackwell remained standing, arms folded behind his back. We'll be holding a ceremony. Proper recognition. Your story, your service, deserves its place here. I didn't come for that. We know, Hayes said quietly. That's what makes it necessary. Joe looked down at the flag in his lap, creased, weathered, and faded, edges fraying from decades of careful folding. The name stitched into the hem, Michael O'Connor, was nearly invisible now. His younger brother. Killed in Vietnam, 1968. Joe had carried this flag home himself, tucked beneath his flak jacket, heartbroken and silent. He was the good one, Joe whispered. No, Blackwell said. You're both part of that story. Across the hall, the museum's director approached hesitantly, wringing her hands. Mr. O'Connor. I want to personally apologize. What happened today was inexcusable. Joe met her eyes. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to the ones who can't walk in here anymore. She faltered, then nodded. You're right. We're amending our entry policy today, she continued. Effective immediately. No veteran will be turned away based on documentation alone. Their word and record will stand. And, we'll be dedicating a wing to those who served in forgotten conflicts, Vietnam, Beirut, Somalia. Places where sacrifice was real, but recognition was rare. Joe said nothing. His gaze had shifted to a far wall where a glass case displayed battered combat boots from the Tet Offensive. One boot still held clumps of dried mud. Time sealed inside. I remember this, he muttered. Hayes tilted her head. You were there? Near Hugh City. February 68. We had 5 days of rain, 2 of sun, then mortar fire every night. We lost 23 men in 1 week. He stood slowly and walked to the display. Behind the glass was a photo, blurry, black and white. A squad of Marines in a rice paddy, soaked and skeletal with exhaustion. Hayes blinked. Is that you? Joe peered closer. It was. Third from the left. Michael was beside me, but they cut him out. Maybe he moved. He was always moving. Silence. Blackwell placed a hand on Joe's shoulder. We can put him back in. Joe looked up. That won't bring him back. No, Blackwell agreed. But it might keep others from being forgotten. The story moved quickly. A photo of Joe standing before the exhibit, flag in hand, flanked by General Blackwell and Colonel Hayes, went viral. Veterans from across the country began sharing their own experiences of being dismissed, misjudged, unseen. News anchors debated the state of veteran recognition. A segment titled "The Man Outside the Museum" aired on 3 networks in one night. Joe's phone rang off the hook, though he barely touched it. He didn't care for screens. But he noticed the change when he returned to the museum the next day. This time, no line. A Marine in dress blues stood at the entrance and saluted him before holding the door open. The plaque on the wall near the door was new, in honor of all who served, seen and unseen. Inside, a crowd waited. Schoolchildren, other veterans, and families stood in hushed lines near the expanded wing now under construction. A temporary display had already gone up, a black and white image of Joe and Michael, side by side, mid-march, helmets low over their eyes. The caption beneath read, "Brothers in Arms, the O'Connor Legacy." A young girl tugged at her father's sleeve as Joe passed. "Is that the real soldier?" Her father knelt beside her. "Yes. He's one of the ones who made it home." Joe kept walking, eyes fixed ahead. That weekend, he returned again. And again the next. Always arriving early, flag in hand, before the crowd stirred. He found a quiet corner in the Hall of Honor and sat there as the morning light filtered through the tall windows. Sometimes people approached to thank him. Sometimes they just nodded and kept walking. Joe never expected anything from them. On Sunday morning, a familiar voice called out behind him. "You still sit in the same spot." Joe turned. It was Blackwell, dressed casually for the first time in years, hands tucked into the pockets of his civilian coat. "I figured you'd be off saving the world." Blackwell chuckled. "No. You've done more with a quiet bench than I have with speeches." They sat together. "You know," Blackwell began, "when you saved me. I didn't even see your face. Just heard your voice, saying, 'Stay awake, Lieutenant. Don't let go.' I held on to that for 40 years. Joe didn't respond immediately. "Then, I remember. You were bleeding through your boots. I wasn't sure we'd make it. I never told anyone who got me out. They would have made you a celebrity. You disappeared." Joe shrugged. "Didn't want to be a hero. Just wanted to make it home." Blackwell looked down. "You did. And you brought others with you. That's more than most." Joe leaned back. "It's strange. I spent years trying to forget. And now everyone wants me to remember." Blackwell smiled faintly. "Sometimes, remembering is how we rebuild." By the second week, a small wooden sign had been placed under the tall window where Joe sat each Sunday. "Reserved for Sergeant Joseph O'Connor, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, in honor of all who waited to be seen." He never asked for it. Once, he even tried removing it, but the staff replaced it by morning, this time with a carved Marine emblem. Joe's ritual became part of the museum's rhythm. The security team brought him coffee. A curator left stars and stripes folded neatly beside a Veterans Day program. Tour guides began to mention him softly, like a living relic. The first time he was asked to speak, Joe declined. "I'm not much for crowds," he said, fingers smoothing the flag on his lap. But then, a group of high schoolers wandered in with notebooks and nervous questions. One approached, "Mr. O'Connor, what did it feel like?" Joe blinked. What felt like? To serve. To lose someone. To come home. He didn't answer at first. Silence stretched out. Then he gestured for them to sit. And for the first time in decades, he spoke their names, not with grief or grandeur, but like a gardener tending to soil long ignored. He described Michael's laugh, loud even during mortar fire. The stink of jungle boots, the hiss of a Zippo lighting a soggy letter. The metallic tang of adrenaline as chopper blades beat through smoke. By the end, the students were hushed. Some cried. Joe looked at the floor. They called us ghosts when we came back. But ghosts remember what the living forget. After that, he was never alone again. On Veterans Day, the museum held a rededication. Rows of chairs lined the plaza. A color guard stood at attention. The city mayor, museum director, and General Blackwell all gave speeches. When it was Joe's turn, the microphone stayed unused. Joe stood on the steps, flag in hand, and said one sentence. I didn't come back to be honored, I came back because I still carry the ones who didn't. Applause broke out, loud, standing, and unrestrained. After, a woman approached, 40s, dark hair, eyes glassy. You don't remember me, but I'm Anna. Thomas Riley's daughter. You were with him in Beirut. Joe's eyes widened. Tommy? He said you carried him to the truck after the blast. He died years later from the damage, but he always said he got those last years because of you. She handed him a photo, 2 young Marines, grinning, dirt-smeared. He kept this beside his bed till the end. Joe stared long at it. He couldn't cook worth a damn, but he could play harmonica like nobody else. Anna smiled through tears. Thank you for giving me my dad. Joe gave the photo back. Thank him, for giving me a reason to remember. The seasons turned. Winter brought cutting wind, but Joe never missed a Sunday. His voice grew softer. His hands trembled more. Still, the stories came. Families began timing visits around his presence. Some brought coffee. Some brought old photos or unsent letters. Joe remembered more than anyone expected. He never exaggerated. He never lied. But he always listened. At home, he moved slower. His daughter, Miriam, stopped protesting his visits. Instead, she drove him each week, helping him into his coat and smoothing the collar. You sure you're up for this? I've never been more sure of anything, he always said. One night, she brought down a box from the attic. Found this. Might be yours. Inside, faded uniforms, yellowed photos, and a journal he hadn't opened since 1974. He read it all night, hearing a young man's voice in his own handwriting, fierce, determined, naive. He laughed at how serious he'd once been. And cried when he found the last page, a letter to Michael he never mailed. Still can't forgive myself. Still trying to say your name without choking. He closed the journal. On a bitter Sunday, Joe didn't show. The staff waited. Visitors asked. Colonel Hayes called his phone. No answer. At home, Miriam opened the door in a robe. He's resting, she said. Tired this morning. Said maybe next week. But he didn't come the week after either. On the third Sunday, General Blackwell arrived at Joe's bench alone. In his arms was the flag, refolded and stored in a polished oak box. Behind him stood 6 Marines in dress uniform. Blackwell placed the box on the bench and saluted. He passed peacefully, he told the small crowd. At home. Surrounded by letters, photos, and his brother's name on his lips. The silence that followed wasn't just mourning, it was reverence. That night, the museum stayed open late. Visitors filed past Joe's bench, pausing to touch the box, whisper thanks, or leave offerings. Kids drew pictures. Veterans left patches. One man placed his Purple Heart on the bench and walked away in silence. Colonel Hayes remained well after closing, seated beside the flag. He didn't want a statue, she whispered. Blackwell nodded. We'll give him something better. By spring, a permanent display replaced the wooden bench, a bronze plaque embedded in stone, the flag case sealed behind tempered glass, flanked by 2 spotlights. Beneath it, etched in small but firm letters, Sergeant Joseph Joe O'Connor, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. Not all heroes are seen in battle. Some are seen when they come home. Visitors paused daily. Not for spectacle, but for silence. Parents explained softly to their children. Veterans left coins on the base, pennies for remembrance, quarters for service side by side. The museum made no announcement. The space simply became sacred. Miriam returned often, sometimes with her teenage son. One Sunday, she placed her hand on the plaque and whispered, "He never stopped carrying them." Her son, eyes wide, just nodded. Elsewhere, the ripple widened. A photo had emerged, Joe on the bench, flag in lap, sun haloing his head. It was taken quietly by a museum visitor weeks before his death. The image spread online like wildfire. The caption read, "He came not for praise, but to remember those we forgot." It was shared by senators, generals, athletes, and even celebrities. A retired Marine Corps commandant wrote, "We build monuments of stone, but this man was a monument in flesh." Joe O'Connor, who had never posted a single status, became a symbol across the nation. Talk shows debated museum access for elderly vets. One former Air Force sergeant recounted being turned away in a different state. "Joe's story gave me the courage to speak up." New legislation was proposed, nicknamed the O'Connor Bill, aiming to remove barriers for aging and undocumented veterans. It passed unanimously in 3 states within 2 months. Back in Riverstone, something more subtle stirred. Local high schoolers began interviewing elderly veterans for history class. Scout troops delivered care packages to long-retired servicemen and women. A modest uptick in museum attendance revealed a deeper truth: people wanted to remember. They just needed to know how. The museum hosted a quiet night vigil on Memorial Day. Hundreds gathered in the dark. Candles flickered like watchfires. At midnight, a bell rang once for each name etched into the memorial wall. When it reached O'Connor, Joseph, a collective hush followed. Colonel Hayes stepped forward. "I served 22 years. Saw combat. Lost friends. But it wasn't until I sat beside Joe that I understood what remembrance really meant." She laid a folded letter beside the plaque, her resignation. "I'm dedicating the rest of my life to telling stories like his." Meanwhile, General Blackwell took no interview requests. When pressed, he responded only once, via an op-ed in a Sunday edition of the Washington Post. "Joe O'Connor once pulled me from fire. I repaid him with medals and silence. Too little, too late. We who survive have 2 tasks, to live fully, and to carry the names of those who can't." Joe carried them with such dignity, I nearly forgot he needed someone to carry his name, too. Now we will. One rainy afternoon, a man stood at the edge of the museum garden. Tall, sharp-featured, with a prosthetic arm and faded camo jacket. He wore no rank, bore no insignia, but his stance said soldier. He stared at the plaque for nearly 20 minutes, unmoving. A staffer approached quietly. "Were you with him?" The man nodded once. "Vietnam. 1971, he gave me a cigarette when I thought I was dead." Then he turned and walked away. 2 months later, a veteran in Kansas posted photos of a flag raising in his backyard. Caption, "For Joe. For the ghosts he carried. For the rest of us still learning to forgive ourselves." Within days, similar posts appeared from Florida to Alaska. Front yards, rooftops, churchyards, even one above a firehouse, flags raised not for a nation alone, but for the unseen burdens veterans bore after war. A national movement began. Flags for Joe, they called it. People sent in stories. A granddaughter found her grandfather's medals buried in a drawer after seeing Joe's image. A teacher rewrote her syllabus to include oral histories of forgotten wars. A cafe offered free meals to veterans every Sunday, Joe's Day. The plaque in Riverstone became a pilgrimage site. But no one spoke loudly there. Not in that space. On what would have been Joe's 86th birthday, the museum opened a new wing. Simple in design. Quiet. Lined with letters and audio recordings, it was titled, The Carriers. Inside, a recording of Joe's voice, soft, cracked, and unmistakably his, played on loop. They don't teach you how to come home. But you come back anyway. Not because you're whole, but because you owe it to the ones who didn't. The last section of the wing included an empty bench under a photograph of Joe's spot. A sign beside it read, Sit. Remember. Speak their names. And people did. Widows. Grandchildren. Tourists. Marines in dress blues. Even schoolchildren sat in that stillness, tracing invisible names in the air with their fingers, listening to a silence thick with memory. The wing became the most visited part of the museum. At night, a janitor often lingered near the plaque before locking up. He never met Joe. But every shift, he'd sweep gently beneath the flag case and nod to the bench. One night, the museum director caught him doing it. You okay, Dave? The janitor just smiled. Yeah. Just saying goodnight. And he did. Every time. Never forgotten.